All right, as folks are introducing themselves, we can go ahead and get started. We're really excited to share the results of a multi-year study that we did in collaboration with the Gateway Cities Council of Governments, who very kindly reached out to us to do this work. It built on a study that California Forward that we did in collaboration with Spur in the Bay Area that got some attention around the fiscalization of land use. And I do want to just state at the start that that work and methodology was really the brainchild of Fred Silva, who's been part of California Forward and someone that I've been able to learn a lot from over the years, who's probably literally spent half a century on California state and local fiscal issues and housing issues. And it's a real tremendous, both human and resource. So with that, we'll kind of, the way to give you a quick run of show, what we're going to be doing is presenting the results of the study, talk through that, and then we'll also have, Adam from CCB, who's one of our partners on the study, will give kind of an overview of how this translates into the state policy landscape. And then we have our friend Constantine from California YIMBY, who will give some thoughts and reactions about how this ties into the ongoing and latest and greatest from the California housing policy space. With that, I will kind of give you, we'll go into the webinar. So Isa, can you go to the next slide? So it should not be news to many folks that California has a housing crisis and specifically an affordability crisis. We are looking within the gateway cities in South and Southeast LA County. And when you look across the county of Greater Los Angeles, that there is a shocking 0% of folks who earn a relatively typical income who can afford a typically priced home. So there's a very real challenge there. And if you go to the next slide, when you add that up across the entire state, the gap between what people can actually afford and what the price people can actually pay, that's a $62 billion gap, which also speaks to the opportunity that we'll talk about later, is that there's a real, if we can unlock a lot of the city budgetary challenges, there's a real economic development opportunity, because this is an opportunity to, as we bridge that gap, to build wealth, and particularly from disadvantaged communities who have been left out of that process for far too long. And then if you go to the next slide, here's the thing we really wanted to emphasize. California Forward has as part of our policy roadmap, we have a strong commitment to the importance of increasing housing production across the state. And you can see, although there's been a lot of progress in recent years about, kind of new opportunities to build new housing, and we're in the middle of our 6th regional housing needs analysis process, there still has not been the level of housing that is needed to really address and make a dent in this ongoing affordability crisis. So we'll hear more on that to come. Can you go to the next slide? And one of the big reasons, one of the reasons that we're here today to disentangle is that part of the challenge with building new housing within California is that our convoluted municipal finances present a barrier to making housing make sense in too many cities. So to give you a quick overview of a very in-depth history of that the Legislative Analyst's Office did a really excellent job around the Assembly Bill 8, which was the bill that was kind of the cleanup bill that was passed in the wake of Proposition 13. So we're talking about not the actual 1% property tax, cap, but within that, how the 1% of property tax revenues gets allocated to cities, school districts, and counties. And the short version of how it was initially set is that it had to do with how much property taxes were being collected prior to the passage of Prop 13. And there's been a variety of, additional layers and nuances around the state and local fiscal relationship. But the one thing to pass there is that there's definitely an equity issue in terms of just a generational issue around, just because a community happened to be less affluent in the late 70s doesn't mean that they should be that way forever. And that is one of the kind of core original drivers for why there is a disparity in different property tax allocations between cities in the Gateway region and other parts of the state, because it ranges pretty widely, as you'll see in some of the subsequent charts. Can you go to the next slide? And with that, what I want to do is introduce you to my colleague and partner, Melanie Smith from the Gateway cities, who very kindly asked us to embark on this study, and has been quite the journey to give a little bit of background about what the Gateway cities are. And over to you, Melanie.
Thanks, Patrick. So appreciate everyone being here this afternoon, and it's great to be able to talk about this work. I am Melanie Smith. I'm Director of Regional Development for the Gateway Cities Council of Governments, which covers Southeast Los Angeles County, and is really depicted on this map. We're comprised of 27 member cities and parts of unincorporated LA County. Our COG was formed over 20 years ago because cities in our subregion didn't feel that they had a voice or representation in decisions that were being made by outside agencies that really affected their future. And this was largely at the time related to the development of transportation corridors. You can see the red lines on the map. The freeway corridors that really traverse our subregion, and the 105 freeway was being developed at that time. So transportation and the related air quality and climate policy areas have always been key for us. And there's a real legacy of air quality problems and a legacy of environmental justice issues. And now we're looking at significant climate vulnerabilities that plague our subregion. 71% of our census tracts are classified as disadvantaged communities. And that's versus 50% of LA County census tracts are classified as. And our economic development policy work has really been focused on the fiscal challenges that our low, nearly no property tax return contract cities in many cases face. So then I came along just over 2 years ago to stand up a suite of programs in housing to add to our work that had already been longstanding on the homelessness issues, and adds a range of work programs, all with the sole purpose of increasing the supply of affordable housing in the subregion. And this study that we partnered with California Forward on is one of those programs. And just to say, by the way, the housing work we've led has been wide-ranging, as I said, and one of the other recent successes from the program has been that our cities have again come together as a subregion to form a Gateway Cities Affordable Housing Trust just in February of this year. So this is another new joint powers authority, of which 17 of our cities are already members, that's just getting underway to help fund affordable housing in our subregion. We're really proud of that. Next slide. As I mentioned before, many of our cities are contract cities, meaning they contract with other public and private entities to provide municipal services. These cities, and this is a challenging chart to see, but I'll tell you about what it's showing you in a second. These cities end up with small staffs and really limited local capacity. But what this chart is showing you is our population densities in our subregion and in many of our cities. You can see that our cities are really contending with very large populations and dense concentrations of populations, rivaling major American cities like Manhattan that you just wouldn't necessarily think about. Next slide. And as you'd expect with population density and an expensive housing market, we face overcrowding in many of our cities. You can see that we stand out in Los Angeles County in this chart, in this characteristic as well. The concentration of darkest red cities are most overcrowding or largely in our subregion. And if we didn't understand the truly grave challenges that come with this overcrowding. The pandemic, the COVID infection and death concentrations in our subregion that really mirror this map have underscored the inequities that our populations face. Next slide. This infographic depicts the distribution of Gateway City's households in the extremely low, very low, low and moderate income categories. And roughly 60% of our households are in these categories. We have a large majority of renters versus homeowners. You can see the housing ownership bars are, quite skewed toward renters and not toward home ownership. And we have high rates of severe cost burden in our lower income category households as well. You can see that housing cost burden, those those pie charts on the bottom in the extremely low and the very lower, dramatically majority cost burden households. Next slide. So we have a significant burdened population in our subregion, and we can really see the need for housing here. The Gateway City share of the regional housing needs allocation, it's being depicted in this chart, has really increased dramatically. We in this subregion, we've got this substantial population, and we've got an increase in our regional housing needs allocation, but this is coupled with a really limited land base in many of our communities. If you do a search for vacant land in some of our cities, you come up with no parcels, which is hard for state agencies sometimes to believe, or 1 or 2 parcels. So enter retail to residential land conversion. It's not a new idea, but one that's really dramatically gaining traction, and it's figured much more prominently in our city's 6-cycle housing elements than in previous cycles, as many different strategies are gaining traction. But that's a really important idea as our cities seek to figure out not if, but how and where they can demonstrate the capacity for new housing. Cities in the COG had really long been grappling with fiscal issues and the potential impact of the increasing cost of municipal services provision for residents of new housing in small, constrained local budgets. They hadn't had a lot of data to bring into the conversation. So when I ran across the policy brief that Patrick already referenced, that California Forward had developed for SPUR, looking at Bay Area cities and looking at relationships between low property tax return and low housing production, I thought it would be useful, and really we in the COG thought it would be useful to duplicate that study and provide some evidence around this issue in our subregion and we'll continue the conversation really with the goal to make some policy recommendations that would be responsive to our city's particular fiscal needs and the needs of their current and future residents. So I'm going to hand it back over to Patrick to walk us through the actual study.
Thank you, Melanie. And Isa, if you can go to the next slide. This kind of summarizes how this study and this piece builds analytically with what we did in the Bay Area in 2021. So in addition to doing a high-level correlation of what the city's property tax allocation is and what the housing actually produced was across the cities, which I'll show in a moment, we also did some specific site analysis, which we'll give you an example of, as well as a net fiscal impact analysis across the 6th RENA cycle, all of which are, so we did some pro forma financial modeling, which was a special kind of fun, I'll tell you that. And moving on to the next slide, this is kind of similar to what we were able to do in the Bay Area. And what we see here is that the gateway cities are some of the lowest property tax allocation cities across the state. So these are known as no and low property tax share cities. And you can see that in this box and whisker plot, the middle piece there. And what we saw in the Bay Area was that the lowest third of cities in the Bay Area had a markedly lower housing production, lowest third in terms of property tax allocation. They had a much lower housing production. And if you go to the next slide, we see that the gateway cities had much less housing production compared to the rest of LA County and the rest of the state. So there's, definitely some strong correlation. And then if we go to the next slide, you can see here is we built on that to actually get down to the level of specific parcels. And what we looked at is particularly commercial and industrial, particularly commercial. There's been a lot of focus with some recent state legislation and unlocking opportunities and streamlining how non-economic retail zones could be redeveloped. So we looked at a lot of sites that kind of fit those criteria across the COG, as well as some other ones. So we'll see one particular example at Cerritos. And what we did is constructed a pro forma financial analysis. So we looked at, if these were to be redeveloped with housing, what would be the new revenues being generated, not just property taxes, but also looking at the motor vehicle licensing fee, the triple flip, which if you remember back from the Schwarzenegger era was part of some of those budgetary deals, as well as what, there's going to be new residents, which means that there's opportunities for new sales tax generated as part of these housing. But then there also, if you're talking about losing retail, there's also, if you're losing retail space, there's, sales tax loss. And then also very critically, modeling what would be the cost of additional services. And, because cities have, certain things that, you're not going to build a new city hall. You're not going to have to do operation and maintenance on that facility just because you have, 1,000 or whatever the number is, new residents. But there are additional, requests. There's going to be additional people driving on the streets, which is maintenance. You're also going to have, there's police and fire. There's things like that. There's all sorts of city services that, cities have to make their budgets pencil out. So what we did here is try to look at what are additional revenues and what are additional costs so that we could have a net fiscal impact analysis. And we were trying to do, and as you'll see later, we did a lot of sensitivity analyses to showcase what this would look like across a range of assumptions. So if we go to the next slide, here's the former Sears site, and this was the one that we wanted to flag because it was kind of a prototypical, commercial retail to residential conversion. This is the site being overlaid with our urban footprint partners, and what you can see here. If you go to the next slide, what you can see is the conceptual renderings of some of the things of what they're looking like from the developer in terms of what it could look like after redevelopment. And then if you go to the next slide, we can see the actual net fiscal impact analysis where we show that there is a ballpark $1.7 million negative net fiscal impact, largely as a result of you're losing some sales tax, and you're losing there's an additional new residence cost. So, and the new revenue doesn't quite make up for it. And you can see the property tax capture is pretty low, and which speaks to the underlying dynamic with that these cities are not capturing, that there's property tax being generated, though a lot of it actually doesn't return to the city itself. It'll be going to the county, the school districts, the water districts, other things like that. Melanie, was there anything else you wanted to add on this site?
Just to say that we reached out to our cities and we were trying to identify these case studies, and we were trying to identify different types, and so this just seemed like one of the really obvious case study types that not just Cerritos but several of our cities with large regional commercial facilities, mall facilities are really thinking about what is the future of, and ways to keep those viable and enhance the community and accommodate new housing. So it's not the only type. We're looking at corridor sites, retail to residential conversions along commercial corridors as well, as you saw in the map.
Great, thank you. And also just emphasize, my colleague Jennifer Lovett put in the chat that to please, if you have any questions, we see them coming in, and we'll be answering those at the conclusion of the presentation. If they're kind of general, and if there's anything specific, we'll try to integrate those into the discussion. And as to Melody's point, we had a very collaborative process with the city managers, planners, economic development, in the various committees through the COG to select these sites. This one was particularly illustrative. And then we used a similar methodology to scale up from the parcel, these specific case study sites to go, if you go to the next slide, to be able to see what was the impact across the region, the sub-region for the regional housing needs analysis. Issa, if you could go to the next slide. So there what we see is a ballpark $37 million annual fiscal impact at the full build out from RENA. There's a couple of things to note there. This is using reasonable assumptions, and I'll walk you through a variety of other scenarios and inputs that go into the model. This is, again, it's a model. There's a lot of creative things that it's not reality. It's that we're looking at what would be the reasonable expectation if you were to just be building housing as a result of this. There are a lot of creative opportunities that cities could be doing, things like enhancing infrastructure financing districts, Koreas. There's a lot of things that they could be doing in terms of collaboration to develop new revenue sources. There's opportunities for reforms, either in the vein of those EIFDs and other policy reforms that we'll be talking about here. So this is not inevitable. This is more of an illustrative model, which is, the goal is to showcase that this is a real issue, and this is a real issue that needs to and deserves to be addressed across the subregion and across the state. If we want to be serious about meeting the state's housing production objectives, we want to be very clear-eyed about what are the challenges that cities face from a financial perspective. And here you can go to the next slide. We had a lot of fun with this. We went and had a lot of fun with our our technical working groups through the COG to do a variety of modeling assumptions to look at, to stress test this in all sorts of different ways. Because, would there be larger, could there be different levels of sales tax loss? Could there be different levels of persons per household? Can you be looking at different, there's some nuance around the data sources with, we use the state controller's office numbers, which is what the legislative analyst office and office use on the statewide policy basis. There's some other kind of more locally sourced data in terms of the property tax allocation. And the thing I would emphasize here is that across a range of assumptions, that what we see is that there is, out of 7 out of 8 scenarios that we examined, that there is a very substantial, very non-trivial challenge around how these, what the negative net fiscal impact across the cities.
Hey, Patrick.
Yes.
We have a couple of questions that might be good to just check in on here. So one is, maybe it is factored into your variables, but these impacts are assuming that the commercial is being converted to 100% residential. Is that correct?
Or, yes, and Melanie, let me know if you want to jump in there as well. So again, this is, there's a lot of opportunities that cities could do creative things with mixed use and a lot of other opportunities there. Melanie, would you want to add anything on that note?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think this is just where the model, this is where we started with the model to look kind of simply. It's a bit of a challenge to start modeling mixed use scenarios.
Yeah, because it's like we definitely show sales tax gain, and the way that we show that within the model, it's somewhat optimistic, I would argue, in terms of how we show, how much of that is captured within the city. So the way the model is, it's fairly agnostic of whether or not that's like with with a site, if that's through existing retail like elsewhere within the city, or if it's on that specific site. But yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that there's a lot of kind of nuance there. So again, it is a model, and we're trying to use reasonable assumptions to showcase what reasonably could happen absent reform.
And one more, Patrick, just because I think this might be related. You might have answered it, but someone asked, isn't this a static analysis? Wouldn't new residents spend more money in the existing stores and restaurants? And if Sears is a dead mall store, are you really losing money?
Yeah, I think this kind of speaks to the same question. So we definitely had a variable within the analysis around new sales tax generated from new residents, and that so that was part of the model and what we included on the positive revenue side of the what would result from the new housing being produced. And when we were at the level of like specific sites and parcels, we definitely got there was a greater deal of nuance. Dan, happy to talk to you there at some point offline if you want. But we looked at the induced sales tax as kind of did some geospatial analysis through our urban footprint partners. But great questions. Thank you so much. Cool. So continuing on with this, so what we see here is that there, on the other side of the ledger, the one thing I'd flag is that we often assumed a $700,000 assessment per unit with condos, and some of these communities that arguably would be relatively positive. So if you look at things like more of a $500,000 assessment, that obviously lowers the property tax and the MVLF swap, which results in a lower net fiscal impact. So there's different, you could play within the assumptions on different sides. We tried to be as transparent as possible about what some of the key factors are and how it adjusts the model. And I think the key takeaway is that, if you were to do things like we also have here, the result of, if you see the third result down, of no sales tax loss. And so if you see that, there's still actually a negative net fiscal impact across the subregion. So there obviously, again, it's like the point is to emphasize is that there is a real issue and a real challenge that these cities face. There are opportunities to be creative in terms of on both the development and the land use side, to be using kind of land use as as currency and for cities with conversations with developers. There's also a lot of things that cities can be doing through, again, EIFDs and other kind of bottom up, using the existing policy tools that are available. And our kind of point here is to emphasize that that this is a challenge that we can work through and collaboratively address together, because we want to be we want to see, as part of our policy roadmap, as I say at the top, California Forward, we want to see more housing being produced so that we can address this statewide housing crisis that we face. And we want to be thinking, creatively and collaboratively around how we can develop, assistance programs for cities so that cities can be meeting their RENA objectives that, are accretive to the local economy and are positive across the state.
Patrick, one of the other things we could say at this point is that we wanted to, offer to our cities sort of a simplified version of this model that they could use and in a more site-specific way, I think, to really look at how these variables play out in particular circumstances for them. Because we do recognize, as you're saying, that it isn't a one size fits all, and in some circumstances you're going to have different levels of sales tax loss, et cetera. So that's something that I think will be helpful to some of our cities who don't always haven't had the opportunity to have a tool like that.
Yeah, I think that's as part of the urban footprint partners as part of our team have been looking at the piece as well, and have been very iterative. This is a static snapshot and point in time using specific assumptions as part of the report. So this is happening in real time with the sixth RHNA cycle and is on an ongoing process. And then we can go to the next slide. As we look towards the solution side of the ledger, these are the principles for how we can be addressing and thinking structurally. These are coming from the report that we developed in collaboration with Spur. Just pretty common sense things around how we can, have a tax system that, is fair, provides adequate revenues, not be discouraging housing production. And the fourth one is something that if you spend time with California's municipal finance, is an opportunity for a lot of improvement. Is there's a California forward saying that complexity is the enemy of equity. And when you talk about a lot of these issues, there's no shortage of complexity, and it is not a friend of equity. And based on that, you can go to the next slide and we can see our plan on a move forward basis. We see this report as it's really helping to set the agenda and help set the table so that we can continue the conversation around and work collaboratively around how we can be developing policy solutions to address this fiscalization of land use, how we can be removing these fiscal barriers to housing production. There's a variety of tools. The three listed here are something that come from way back when, from the California Forward founding. These were items that were being discussed right at the beginning. Things around. I know Fred Silva would talk a lot about how Assembly Bill 8. It's kind of a funny way to do it, right? To set largely set in stone with some adjustments over the years, but setting what percent of the property tax the city gets within its boundaries based on just where they happen to be in the late 70s. Just because you were poor then doesn't mean you should be poor forever. So there are things that you could do a legislative reform there that would definitely be a big lift. There's also opportunities for property tax swaps. Then there's also opportunities for state grants or subsidies. You could also do things on that around how they could be helping to help subsidize or support, like, say, I know the sub-region is doing a lot of innovative things with their housing trust, also things around EIFDs and things of that nature as well. And what we want to California is kind of facing it's not entirely clear what's going to be happening with the economy. We're in an interesting moment with some hiccups in the inflationary environment that we're in. But every time that there's been a slowdown over the last several decades, there's been some major pushes on reforming the state and local fiscal relationship. There's been major reforms around some tax and governance issues. And so there will potentially be an opportunity to make some headway on these long-running challenges and do some good that moves California forward. So with that, I will pass the baton over to our colleague Adam Briones to give you a little bit of more flavor about how data and policy fits into the larger housing space.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. And let's see, are you all going to pull up my PowerPoint or should I share? Oh, there we go. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Adam Briones, and I'm CEO of California Community Builders. I'm here to talk about how knowing is half the battle, thinking about how we can use data, research, and compromise to help solve the California housing crisis. And basically what I'm going to be doing today is kind of zooming out a little bit because, Patrick, Melanie, the entire team has done such a fantastic job with the report they're putting out and really kind of highlighting some of the more complicated technical issues that we face as a state as we think about providing enough housing for everybody that needs it. And I'm certainly not going to be able to tell you more about the technicalities than they are. And, my colleague Constantine from California YIMBY, who's coming on after me, certainly knows a lot more about what's going on in Sacramento than I do. So I thought about, what I could be talking about. And so I'm really going to be focusing on some of the higher level overarching issues we face as a state in general, as well as from a race equity perspective. So really excited to chat with everybody today. Next slide, please. But being a good nonprofit executive, I'm going to do a short commercial for my organization. California Community Builders is a nonprofit public policy organization that's working to close the racial wealth gap using housing and home ownership as our primary tool. And every now and again, we get some slides that are cut off. So my guess is that my slides during this presentation are going to be cut off at the bottom, but that's no big deal. Next slide, please. All right, let's see. So in terms of our focus, we work on everything and focus on everything from housing production and zoning to small developers of color, and specifically asking the question, do communities of color have a direct and overseeing role in how our neighborhoods grow and evolve? And then once the housing is actually built, really thinking about, do communities of color have access to the mortgages and capital they need to buy the homes? Next slide, please. Great. Next up, really thinking about what does CCB actually do? And so we focus on research. We produce reports on things like multifamily home ownership. We actually just released legislative analysis of what's going on in Sacramento right now around home ownership legislation. And then we also, once a program has been passed and good legislation has been signed by the governor, work to implement those programs and policies so that the communities that are meant to benefit on paper benefit in reality. And then we also run a leadership academy so that young people are ready to step into our shoes, once we get ready to retire. Next slide, please. Great. So really quickly, as Patrick mentioned, we face a real crisis around housing supply here in California. And as the Little Hoover Commission stated in a recent report, when prices go up when demand severely outpaces supply. And so I'm just going to throw a few facts and figures out there. CalHCD has said that we need about 180,000 homes per year to meet demand. But since 2015, I believe we've only produced about 45% of the housing units that we've needed as a state. So in terms of the folks that are coming to California since 2010, California has added about 3.2 times more people than housing units. And, we want more people. We want more immigrants. We want more people to come here, start businesses, build a better life. But we fundamentally need the housing to make sure that they have a place to live. And then do also just want to flag that as a state, California really leads the nation in the people to housing ratio. Here in California, we have about 2.93 Californians for every occupied home, compared to about 2.53 across the country. And so we're really leading the pack in a bad way. And then just because we are talking about Southern California, do also want to flag that these problems don't come from nowhere. Los Angeles back in 1960 was zoned for about 10 million people. But in 1980 was downzoned to accommodate only 4 million people. And so really some of the policy decisions we've made at the local and state level really are driving some of the issues that we're facing today. And then of course, pre-SB 9, 75% of the city of Los Angeles was zoned single family only. So really thinking about the ways that we have prioritized one of the diversity of housing types. And of course, single family homes are the most expensive out there. So really thinking about the ways in which that policy decision has impacted us. Next slide, please. Great. And so also thinking about the fact that things weren't always this way in California. Back in 1969, the home price to income ratio was 2.6. So the median home cost about 2.6 times the median income. But when you zoom forward to 2020, that figure's increased dramatically. And so back as of 2020, the average home price to income ratio was 8.5%, 8.5 times. So that's a really significant increase there. Next slide, please. And of course, there's a real geographic element to this conundrum we find ourselves in. So while some places like far Northern California, you still can buy a median priced home for less than the median income. If you want to buy the 100% of the median priced home in Los Angeles County, you need to make 149% of the median priced income. And our friends down in Orange County, it's even worse. To own the median priced home in Orange County, you have to make 156% of the median income. And so we really do need to be thinking about places like the Bay Area, Los Angeles, Orange County, even the Central Coast and San Diego, where it's just so much, you have to make so much more than the median income to buy the median priced home. Next slide, please. Oh, yep, there we go. And of course, CCB is an organization that focuses on closing the racial wealth gap. We spend a lot of time thinking about the racial home ownership gap. Here in California, Latino and Black families only own their homes about 44%, 37% of the time, respectively, compared to white families that own their homes 63% of the time. And we do have one of the lowest home ownership rates overall in the country here in California. Next slide, please. And of course, this home ownership gap directly leads to a racial wealth gap. For every dollar of wealth that a white family has, Latino family only has about 20 cents. And for Black families, it's even worse. They only have about 10 cents for every dollar of wealth held by a white family. Next slide, please. And once we start to disaggregate this by education, some really startling figures come into view. So for Black families with a post-grad degree, so we're talking master's degrees, PhDs, they have about as much wealth as a white family with only high school education. Next slide, please. And for Latino families that have bachelor's degrees, they actually have less household wealth than a white family with just a high school degree. So really thinking about the way in which home ownership plays into the wealth gap, and the way in which the wealth gap is obviously has a lot of big impacts. And sometimes, unfortunately, if you don't own a home, you can have a very high educational attainment, but still not be caught up to other communities. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk about why I think this report, is so important. And so again, Patrick, Melanie have gone over some of the really important data findings, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit to talk about some of the more, I think, philosophical issues. One, quantitative research is invaluable. I think especially as we talk about these complicated topics, the maps that Patrick shared, the data that Melanie shared, I think is really, really important to have a sort of level playing field to talk about these issues. And then second, I think we really need to be able to walk and chew policy gum at the same time. So for instance, we have some problems now in terms of how we apportion tax revenue, in terms of how we sort of rezone for residential development. And then we also have some longer term issues that we need to solve. So really being able to solve policy problems in both the short and long term is going to be vital for our state. And while it's not easy to do either of those, I think we have to prioritize both. And then lastly, I think the issue I want to really end my portion of this on is that we really do need broad, ideologically diverse coalitions to make change. Next slide, please. There's plenty of detail. And actually, next slide, please. And there's plenty of details to argue about. I think that folks like me from the advocacy space that focus on statewide issues around race equity, we have folks like Constantine that are very, very focused on the supply issue. We have California Forward and the work they do. We obviously have the amazing work that the Gateway COG is doing. We all come from different places with different perspectives and different areas of focus. But I do want to emphasize that when we're talking about things like legislative reform, when we're talking about things like tax revenue swaps, when we're talking about things like state grants or subsidies, no one group on its own, no one sector on its own is going to make the type of change that we need, broadly speaking. So I do want to emphasize that it's the ideologically diverse sort of coalitions coming together. When you have the California Forwards with the Gateway COGs, with the California YIMBYs, with the CCB, to me, that's when we can really make a difference. And I think all the folks here on this webinar are representing a broad swath of our state, a broad swath of stakeholders, and really it's going to be all of us stakeholders coming together to solve some of these more complicated issues. And I'll go ahead and end on that. And Patrick, I'll hand the baton back to you.
Thank you, Adam, for that nice overview and philosophical call to arms. On that note, I was going to pass it over before we go to Constantine to Melanie. There's a colleague that many of us and many of you know. Rick Cole has been talking about the need for a grand bargain in housing, but Melanie wanted to share some of his sentiments to kind of, I guess, give a sense of the fierce urgency of now. Melanie, if you wanted to share that.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Adam. I really appreciated that perspective. I think that is exactly what's been so meaningful about this. Is this collaboration amongst a lot of different folks who may not always have the opportunity to be around the same table, starting these conversations. It's mirroring something that we're doing in the Gateway cities. We just formed a regional climate collaborative with 4 different partners with the Gateway cities. And so I think that's what it's all about right now. It's trying to bring folks together into conversation about these really meaty issues. But to that end, when we were thinking about I was thinking about this scope of work and thinking about how to pursue this topic. I had run across an article in the planning report. This was in December of 2020, and it was an interview with Rick Cole. So many of you know, former mayor of Pasadena, city manager in multiple cities, and currently has a role at the city of LA and running for office again. But this was what Rick had to say about this subject in December of 2020. I see the opportunity for a grand bargain on housing between Sacramento and California cities. Cities and pro-housing legislators continue to fight over local control. That dialogue of the deaf remains stalemated. The state's best leverage is rebalancing local revenues away from reliance on sales and other regressive taxes and fees and toward property taxes. People need services. So when cities add people, they should get the revenue that pays for those services. That's more sensible than cities relying on declining brick and mortar retail. It would also help address the jobs housing imbalance that contributes so much to greenhouse gas emissions. Equity considerations should be built into fiscal reform to avoid unintentional consequences. It's time for the governor and legislature to reform our finances for the 21st century. So just wanted to end on that note. Rick wasn't involved in the study. We did have a nice chat about it, but there's just a lot to think about here, and would love to hand over to Constantine now, I think.
Yeah, and I'll just say to that note, it's like we might forge a grand bargain here today, though I do think, just having you here, Constantine, in conversation is definitely a big step forward in terms of, the folks talking very adamantly about, local control is often many of Melanie's members, just to be very candid, and having, California YIMBY and having folks here that we can have, a respectful conversation about state policy solutions. I think, that's what we like to do at California Forward. So really appreciate you having you here, and very excited for your thoughts. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me here. Really appreciate being part of this great discussion, and really looking at this report. I mean, it definitely kind of really highlights, one, I think, to Melanie's point and Adam's call to arms, is that need for folks to come to the table and really try to hash out productive solutions. And I think that's one of the things we're starting to see a little more of now. I know, it's always a challenge when you're tackling these complicated issues, and folks just kind of really have the way that it's always been done kind of ingrained, and just really wanting to, given this crisis, we have to look outside the box and try to find, alternate solutions. And I really appreciate why the way that this report really elevated that need. For one, I think just looking at how we finance, like tax reform it really highlights how important the need is. I mean, if we're looking at cities' revenue being determined from something almost a half a century ago, it's probably time to update that, right? There's a lot of things that were going on about a half a century ago that we are working to reform. And so I think that having that discussion around, are we doing everything we can as a state to support our cities, to incentivize them to want to build housing? I know a couple of years ago, we at California YIMBY, we're doing some advocacy around, some more dollars from the state to go towards cities for infrastructure to help them, to encourage them and make it more feasible for them to build housing, to, support services, to have the right staff in place to implement some of these bills and things like that. It's a little tough now, of course, when the budgets dry up, right? But it's important to have those conversations and move that ball forward down the road. I think so. That's my first thought. I think tax reform is so important. We really have to update our tax system. That's why we were also part of the Schools and Communities First effort to make corporations pay their fair share of taxes, to provide, like somewhere in the words of like 90 billion to communities. That could have been a huge benefit in terms of, supporting, not just home building, but schools and amenities and the things that make cities great. And so, I think that's important for us when we view us at California YIMBY. We really are dedicated to making California a place where families can, say, place to raise your family, work, live a great life, great communities, great inclusive communities. And really, when you look at it from an equity perspective, as you saw with the stats that Adam presented on, not all California communities have been created equal. Not all California communities by design have had access to access to great neighborhoods or having investment in their own neighborhoods. And so there definitely has to be a lot of work done there. And that's some of the work that we've been doing with California community builders and other organizations across the state focused on using the build environment to benefit our BIPOC communities. One perfect example of that is this year's SB 684, where we're looking at, how do we build more starter homes, more home opportunities for home purchase, and really starting to take away and chunk away at that racial wealth gap that Adam pointed out. And so that's a great opportunity to build smaller homes so others can access home ownership and start to build that wealth that our Black and brown communities are so far behind in. So just thinking about, that connection between equity, our cities and the housing, and how our cities have been purposely held back, or some communities have been purposely held back. And if you look at the gateway cities, a lot of those communities are Black and brown communities. It's, probably, and so, just thinking about that, I think is super important. I think another thing, too, just looking at, some of the challenges, given we don't want to necessarily lose that retail. I think it's also an opportunity to look at how are we building more housing opportunity in our single family neighborhoods. I think if you look at some of those gateway cities maps, there's a lot of single family neighborhoods there. And so thinking about, we have, as you saw in Adam's slide, mention of SB 9, how do we unlock some of that to make those more effective? And so part of that, we have our, SB 450, which is just designed to help make SB 9 actually function better, to build that gentle density in some of our single family home neighborhoods, duplexes, fourplexes. Can we expand our ADUs? We have some ADU fixes also coming through the legislature this year. I'm helping some of these past laws that have been designed to spur housing production in a way that is easy on neighborhoods and hopefully not as strenuous on city services. How can we do some of that, and we can start building some opportunities for families to have their own place and not live in overcrowded conditions, which we see is a very huge issue in the Gateway Cities COG. And I know one that Melanie's team is really working to figure out. And so just thinking about, how do we continue to come together, have this dialogue, look at the facts, and really let's continue to do that. I think, so often, I think what we've had is many cities that just weren't willing to come, like it was just all or nothing, like no way, no how. And I think it seems that we're starting to move past that and get into, let's talk about how we can do this and everybody put a little skin in the game and see if we can find a win-win for everybody. And I think that's important. The other thing I just have to call out too, I mean, it's, you have the cities in the Gateway COG, that experience is a little bit different than, say, other cities like in other parts of the state, probably a little further along the coast that are, have the resources to build housing and have not done their fair share, which has helped cause some of the problems in places like the Gateway COG, because they're pushing their housing burden into other places because they're, of course, a little more affordable because they haven't had that economic advancement. And so looking at, making sure that we're also holding cities that are bad actor cities accountable to do their fair share of housing. I know I've talked to certain legislators that are like, hey, look, we're building housing in our city. We're jam-packed here. Not to say that we don't want to build more, but what about my neighbor in that district over there who they're not building anything? And it's, and it isn't fair. And these are a lot of this sentiment is based on direct racist policy. And so we really have to, and I think us at California, like one of our, we're really about like, how do we make sure that we use housing production to counter the systemic racism that's been happening in housing policy over the last, century. And so looking at those cities and making sure that they're building their fair share, that they're opening their cities to different income levels, folks that might look a little bit different like me, and Adam, and really making sure that we're having these types of inclusive cities and that everyone should be able to benefit from, all Californians. So those are just some of my thoughts. I think, unlocking the power of AB 2011, which is the streamlining in commercial zones, is very important. And so how do we continue to do that? And like I said, support cities that really want to do the right thing, but they're facing challenges. How do we make sure that that voice is being part of the discussion and they're not getting looped into other cities that are just saying no to housing in all forms because they really want to hold on to the exclusionary practices of the past. And so I think creating these spaces for this kind of dialogue is important, and hopefully what we can get out of it is great opportunities to create new policy that can help solve some of those issues that places like the Gateway COGs are experiencing in terms of being disincentivized to build housing because they don't have the revenues that they should because of outdated tax share policy.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for sharing that important voice. And the only other thing I'd add is I remember I learned last week that you have some local roots, that a couple of your sons were playing football in Cerritos, which also speaks to, it's important. It's always important to hear from people who have some on the ground experience with,
Oh yeah, I mean, the issue is actually super important to me. Just from a personal background, my grandfather was, his family grew up in Santa Monica, and they actually were, when kind of the Black folks got kicked out of Santa Monica, in that area. They ended up moving to South LA, where later to Willowbrook, where later the 105, I remember as a kid, the 105 coming through their community and dividing that community. So I understand very much the want for communities to be able to have a say in, you know, what happens in their communities, because we can see that it can be problematic when they don't. I think it's important, though, that we're also, you know, that we can't let that be, it's got to be a balance, right? We've got to look at it also from the state, and we can't let that be an excuse for other folks to get out of doing what they should be doing in terms of like really building inclusive communities, and using that kind of excuse like to give them cover from not coming to the table, and really thinking about how can we actually come with some solutions. So, you know, it's very important for me, and I totally understand and get both sides of that. And so I'm just excited that we're able to start working together and start moving things forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, and done right, this is such a tremendous economic development opportunity.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you look at bills like SB 423, which is the AB 35 extension, like that's an opportunity to really get, you know, for affordable housing developers, and especially I think in, you know, places like the Gateway COG, where hopefully we can start seeing some of these, you know, opportunities hopefully start to pencil out a little bit better. So, you know, that's SB 423 is SB 35 extension, which has been a tool. I think it's resulted in about 18,000 units of affordable housing development. It's really been used by affordable housing builders to streamline and get past local opposition to some affordable housing development. And so, you know, if everything checks all the boxes, you pass the environmental impact and all the things that you have to do, municipalities can't say, oh no, but we just don't want that affordable housing in our community, right? And so making sure that we're giving folks access to affordable housing and really expanding that a little bit so that we can really use that. We need all the tools we can, right? And as we know, like the delay in getting development, if you don't get it through at all, can really be a roadblock to development of the property. And it just that's what shoots your costs way up. And so really being able to offer those streamlining opportunities for developers, you know, that are checking all the boxes, that are, you know, doing everything they need to do, other than just the will of, you know, arbitrary decisions that they can't build. So, you know, I think we have to continue to do that. I think the great thing about 423 is it does include the coastal zone, which is a lot of those exclusionary communities. So to help them, encourage them to do their fair share, so they're not putting as much pressure on like places like the gateway cities as well.
Definitely. Please continue to share any questions in the Q&A box. Jennifer, any others that you would want to flag?
There's a comment from someone in here just noting that the different ways that the state's tax structures impact our ability to build housing. So thank you for sharing that. Another question, I think this is just more generally, and I don't know if anyone would want to take this on, is consolidation between neighboring smaller cities a feasible path? What are the regulatory barriers to consolidating municipalities, or are there mostly political barriers?
I know that person asked that question anonymously, which is a very loaded question. Feasible is quite the word. There's something, you know, I would note that, you know, there's the local area formation commissions, and there's a lot of, you know, local governments part of that there. There's also things that can be done legislatively. I'm very familiar with, there's been a variety of movement in this space. So we've had like the, not within cities, but within like the, you know, the water utility space, but the state has taken a very proactive role because there's a lot of like, you know, there's upwards of 1 million Californians that lack access to clean drinking water, including in the urban areas at some of these communities, like when you talk about like the Maywood Mutuals and things like that, where there's just, you know, some very, 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 very real issues. And so there can be opportunities there. They are, you know, political barriers would be, it could be, that's probably an understatement. Melanie, anything you would want to add on that one, or totally fine to say no too?
I really wouldn't. I don't know. Don't have anything to add on that one.
Yeah. Then I also saw there was a comment in the question that from SlowCog about some of the innovative things that they are doing. Krista, that sounds very interesting, and would love to follow up with you, is because we want to kind of continue to collaborate around how different regions of the state could do that there.
Yeah, I noticed that as well. We've had a conversation actually with SlowCog about that, and I think they're doing some great work in that regard. And we, that's something that's come up from our cities. That's really an important corollary piece. They think about revenue, think about cost, but then also think about other costs of really setting the table for housing development and trying to grapple with those very significant infrastructure costs. Again, cities like in our subregion face, in many places, but old infrastructure, undersized infrastructure, a real challenge. So that's a great issue, and hopefully we'll all have the opportunity to look at that a little bit more closely with the additional funding that's coming from the state and the REAP program. That I think there's quite an emphasis on it.
Very good. I invited Krista to just share a little bit about that program if you would like.
Sure. Hi, my name is Krista Jeffries, she, her pronouns. I'm one of the lead organizers for SLO County YIMBY, and I've been following the Regional Housing and Infrastructure Plan. SLO County did our RHNA and our housing elements last year. They got approved all in 2020, 2021, and then as a follow-up to the housing element process, each of the jurisdictions signed on to the Regional Housing and Infrastructure Compact, which was not legally binding. And it was just a symbolic move for each of the jurisdictions to say, look, we need to start planning housing as a region rather than 7 separate cities and then the county that are all kind of functioning separately. So the follow-up to that is developing a housing and infrastructure plan. And the next step for that is to get each of the jurisdictions to sign on to that program. And it basically coalesces all of the jurisdictions' top infrastructure needs. The contractor developing the plan said, send us the top infrastructure needs that you have in order to support more housing. And so they're kind of filtering that through stakeholders and deciding which of those need to be top and which can kind of fall to the bottom. And the biggest ones prioritized water, and they moved most of the infrastructure developments to the top based on who is planning for the most multifamily housing, along with getting the higher share of the RHNA. So it's a little technical, it's kind of complicated, and it hasn't been, super duper public right now. It's still in the stakeholder process, but it's been really interesting to see cross-sectional collaboration across some industries and some leaders in the area kind of really come together and put some meat on the plan. So if the state isn't going to just sort through priorities in that way, then the benefit of local control is you have local control already. You can figure out what those priorities are based on your needs.
Great. Thank you, Christopher. It's always good to hear from other regions. And so with that, I always, invite each of our panelists to maybe offer, kind of short kind of closing thoughts in terms of how you could see, the path ahead. I'll turn it over to Melanie, and then Adam, and then Constantine to round us up.
Thanks, Patrick. One of the things that Adam's comments just really made me think of was one of my favorite philosophers, Albert Schweitzer. Talks about that we have to be deeply aware, and I feel like that's this study is really one step toward that. And then it's just so important to, as we've been saying, inject data and evidence into conversations like this. And so really so pleased to have been able to do that with all of our partners in this. And just again wanted to reinforce what we said previously, that I feel like this is sort of the end of the beginning, or the restart, the continuation of this conversation that's been happening in the COG for a while now. And so looking forward to continuing the conversation with a broader range of partners in the conversation with to moving things forward. And so yeah, more to come. And thanks so much to California Forward for your partnership in this.
Thank you. Pass it over to Adam for final thoughts.
So final thought, I need to know a lot more about tax law. So that's one point A. One point B, I think what this study really drives home for me is just like, at the end of the day, we got to live in reality. And while it's very easy to disagree on the internet, it's very easy to think less of people that disagree with you or perhaps don't make your life easy in terms of the policy goals you're trying to achieve. At the end of the day, I think it's studies like this and it's data like this that just really shows like there's some real concrete issues we got to figure out. And there will always be people that we disagree with. There will always be people who perhaps don't want to see new housing in their communities. But there are plenty of folks and jurisdictions that I think would happily accommodate new residents, happily accommodate new housing. And we just need to figure out how we get there in a way that's equitable, realistic, and a way in which everybody can win. So, really, really thankful to you, Patrick. Thank you to Melanie for bringing us into this study, and really looking forward to, how we turn it into action. Thanks.
Absolutely. Constantine, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just one, thank you for having me and just bringing me into this information, and excited to share it out with the team and look at what pathways, how, we can scratch a little more under that surface and see where there's other pathways to try to help our cities out. If there's, it's just always good to have information. I think, as an organization that really relies heavily on data as we craft policy solutions, reports like this are just so invaluable for us, because it really helps us see where there are holes that might possibly be able to fill. I think being able to bring different perspectives into the discussion is just so valuable, so important. I've been with Melanie on multiple panels at this point, and you wouldn't think that the YIMBY guy in the Council of Governments person would be like, you know what, we see it eye to eye on many things, right? And so it just really highlights, like to Adam's point, that the importance of just having that dialogue, and really having discussion, being able to have data to back up, or really to really showcase, hey, this is a problem. What are different solutions and aspects of this problem that can be uncovered here, that we can find solutions for? And some of them are legislatively, some of them are other ways too. But I think just being able to start with that dialogue is so important. So I just thank you for bringing me into this discussion. Thanks to the other esteemed panelists and all out there are watching. Shameless plug, if you want to hear more about some of the great bills that are happening in the legislature, go to California, cayimby.org. And you can see all of our important bills that are going through, and we'll find out ways to engage on that. And just really looking forward to continuing this dialogue and finding a pathway to getting out of this crisis, as Adam said, in a way that's equitable, that everybody wins, that also benefits the folks that have been, at the front lines of really getting the brunt of this crisis. Our folks of lower income, our communities of color, our young people, our young families, and looking forward to hopefully moving this ball forward down as we continue these great discussions.
Absolutely. And as we move that ball forward, we can reframe things from just kind of, local control versus the state, to, really see an opportunity to have a productive dialogue and a path around how we can empower locals. So local empowerment is a key theme. It would just emphasize to everyone that these policies and, these things that we take as a given, and that can seem very insurmountable, that they were created by humans, not in Californians, not to, just like you or I. So there's opportunity for humans just like you or I to make a difference here and to help move the needle on this ongoing housing crisis, and these ongoing challenges that cities and communities across the state face. So thank you so much for everyone who's come and participated, and thank you for everyone who's participated in the study. It's been very much a team effort. And at California Forward, we've done this in the Bay Area and in the gateway cities. We're definitely open to doing this in other, if it's in SLO, or if it's in Sacramento or Coachella, other regions. We are definitely we see the more opportunity there for there to be a data-based and reality-based conversation that can be an opportunity to empower regions and empower locals as part of our ongoing regions up strategy, and advancing our policy roadmap to shared prosperity. And so we'll have our economic summit in October in Indian Wells. Hope to see you all there. And thank you for your time, everyone. And the link, as Jennifer has shared, is in the chat. So if you haven't heard about the summit will be a great opportunity to continue this conversation. Thank you, everyone.